So, sentence types. All right. So, we've talked about simple sentences, compound sentences, complex sentences. All right. Now, there's a fourth that we're going to talk about today called compound complex. And honestly, you can probably figure it out for yourself after knowing what a compound is and what a complex is. All right. So, review of what we've covered. Simple sentences. Okay. Remember, a simple sentence is one independent clause. That's all it is. Nothing less, nothing more. Okay? One independent clause, period. Boom. That's a simple sentence. Okay? In a simple sentence, all the subjects are doing all the same verbs. That's the key. Okay? If all of the subjects are doing all of the same verbs, it's a simple sentence. It doesn't matter how long or how short it is. Okay? So, two examples. Sally sneezed. Okay? Subject, verb, period, and it makes sense. Simple sentence. Sally and Joe sneezed and coughed. Okay? Two subjects, two verbs, but guess what? When it comes to our subjects and verbs, okay? Sally sneezed, Sally coughed. Joe sneezed, Joe coughed. All of the subjects are doing all of the verbs. Simple sentence. Okay? Both of those are simple sentences. Okay. Now, the next, and again, we should have this partner notes. Okay. If there's anything that's new to you, you can add it. All right. But don't feel like you have to write the whole slide here. Okay. The next big thing that we talked about, run-ons and splices. Okay. Again, there's three major mistakes that people make in their writing. Okay. Run-ons, comma splices, and fragments. So run-ons and splices, these are two of the big ones. When two or more simple sentences are jammed together, okay, and there's no punctuation or conjunctions that are being used, okay, they're just slammed next to each other, no separation, that's a run on. Sally sneezed, Joe coughed, no separation, that's a run on. When two or more simple sentences are separated by only a comma, that's a comma splice. Sally sneezed, comma, Joe coughed. Both of those are wrong. Okay? Both of those are wrong. Okay. In order to fix these, okay, these mistakes, we need to turn them into compound sentences, okay, to correct them. Now there's some other options as well, but the simple fix is to just make them correct compound sentences. When simple sentences are put together correctly, we have a compound sentence. The compound sentence is any sentence made up of multiple independent clauses. It's made up of independent clauses only. Okay? When you have multiple independent clauses and only independent clauses, we have compound sentences. Now, simple sentences can be joined to make a compound in two different ways: using a comma and a fanboy, or using the conjunctive adverb. Okay, now, of course, when you're fixing run ons and splices, a third option is to just put a period in there. Okay, and yes, that does correct the mistake. Okay, however, it does not create a compound. Instead, it just creates two separate simple sentences. Okay, so if you want to make a compound, here's your two methods. Okay, using a comma and a fanboy, or using a conjunctive adverb. So the example would look like this: Sally sneezed, comma, and Joe coughed. Right? That's the comma fanboy in green. Or the conjunctive adverb: Sally sneezed, semicolon, however, comma, Joe coughed. Now, notice one thing here. In both of those examples, okay, let's look at our subjects and our verbs. Okay, Sally and Joe again, sneezed and coughed still. Okay, why is this a compound sentence and not a simple sentence? Remember, it comes down to this. When we look at the subjects and the verbs, okay, who or what sneezed? Sally sneezed, who or what coughed? Joe coughed. There's no crossover. Okay, we have different subjects doing different verbs, right? That's why it's not just a simple sentence anymore. Okay, it's now a compound. We have two separate thoughts, two separate things going on. Sally sneezed, Joe coughed. Okay, different subjects doing different verbs. Okay, now the next major thing. Okay, we've talked about our first two sentence types. We've talked about simple, we've talked about compound. Okay, and the latest thing that we've reviewed is complex sentences. Okay, this is when we started talking about dependent clauses. Okay, so complex sentences. Okay, a complex sentence is the combination of one independent clause plus at least one dependent clause. And remember, a dependent clause has a subject and a verb, but it cannot stand alone as a sentence. It must be attached to an independent clause. Okay, dependent clauses that are punctuated without any connection to an independent clause are fragments, and they're incorrect. It's the third big mistake. Now, all dependent clauses, they all begin with subordinating conjunctions. Words like because, since, unless, when, while, as, before, after. Okay? Basically, any word that you can stick at the beginning of it that makes it so that it can no longer stand alone as a sentence, that's a subordinating conjunction. Okay? You know, rather than just memorizing the huge list, that's what it boils down to. All right? If I have an independent clause like Sally sneezed, okay, great. Any word that I can stick at the beginning of that makes it so it no longer makes sense on its own, that word's a subordinating conjunction. Okay? If I put as Sally sneezed, no longer works as a sentence on its own. As is a subordinating conjunction. If I had said until Sally sneezed, okay, no longer makes sense on its own. Subordinating conjunction. When Sally sneezed, okay, any word that you can stick at the beginning of that sentence, okay, that makes it so it no longer stands alone. Subordinating conjunction. Okay, so what we see here is we see an example of a complex sentence. As Sally sneezed, Joe coughed. Okay? As Sally sneezed is the dependent clause. Okay? Joe coughed is the independent clause. Now, one thing that complex sentences have in common with compound sentences, okay? Just like a compound sentence, we have, even though we have one independent clause and then we have a dependent clause, okay? And we know that the dependent clause needs the independent clause, it has one thing in common. Here's what it has in common. We still have two separate thoughts. Okay? A complex sentence and a compound sentence are similar that way. We have two separate thoughts. Sally sneezed, Joe coughed. Okay? That's the same. All right? Okay. Now, a note about conjunctions. Okay. Coordinating conjunctions. These are your fanboys. Okay? When we say coordinating conjunctions, we're talking about for, and, nor, but, or, yet, so. All right? Those 7 specifically. Coordinating conjunctions and conjunctive adverbs are neutral. This means they don't attach to a specific clause. All right, so if we look at these examples below, okay, Sally sneezed and Joe coughed. Joe coughed and Sally sneezed. It doesn't matter what order you put it in, the conjunction stays in the middle. Okay, it's like a bridge, right? It's a bridge connecting two sides. It's not really connected to any one side more than the other. All right, so same thing with conjunctive adverbs. Sally sneezed. However, Joe coughed. Joe coughed. However, Sally sneezed. Okay, they're neutral. All right. When it comes to subordinating conjunctions, they're different. Subordinating conjunctions are attached to a specific clause. They move with it. All right. So, for example, as Sally sneezed, Joe coughed. Okay. If we want to move that around, we can do that, but the subordinating conjunction moves too. Joe coughed as Sally sneezed. No matter what, that conjunction stays at the beginning of Sally sneezed. It's attached to it. Okay? It's attached to the clause. Now, what we have to remember with this, in the situations where the dependent clause comes first, we got to put a comma after it. Okay, now, this is bringing us up to the most recent thing that we've talked about. We've been talking about relative clauses. Okay, now here's the thing, relative clauses, okay, they are still in that world of complex sentences, okay, dependent clauses. All right, so we're still in that realm of complex sentences when we're talking about relative clauses. All right, so what we've talked about with relative clauses, the big things, those 5 words. When it comes to relative clauses, really comes down to remembering these 5 words right here. That, which, who, whose, whom. And the function of relative clauses is to describe a subject or an object. Now, if the relative clause is the first thing to specify the given subject or object, it's essential. The car that I bought is a Chevy. Okay, that I bought is describing car. It's the first thing to really specify or identify the car. So it's essential. If the clause is not the first thing to specify the given object or subject, it is non-essential. My neighbor's car, which I bought, is a Chevy. Okay, again, the clause is describing car, but it's not the first thing to specify or identify the car. Okay? My neighbor's specifies the car first. Okay, of all the cars in all the world, when I say my neighbor's, that's telling me which car we're talking about. Okay, and it tells me that before we get to the clause. So this is now extra information. It's non essential, and I put commas around it. Okay, next slide's a short one. The combination of an independent clause plus a relative clause is a complex sentence. Okay, so the example you just looked at, okay, the car that I bought is a Chevy. Very, very short, also a complex sentence. Okay, my neighbor's car, which I bought, is a Chevy. Complex sentence. Now, for anyone that is confused on that, okay, if I go back, keep in mind, okay, what throws people off sometimes is sometimes the relative clause interrupts the independent clause, right? But you can see the independent clause if you just delete the relative clause, okay? So if you just imagine that all the stuff in green is gone, look at what we're left with. The car is a Chevy. My neighbor's car is a Chevy. That's the independent clause, okay? That's the independent clause right there, right? The relative clause is that I bought or which I bought, okay? So the combination of those two things is a complex sentence. Okay, now this brings us to the last new thing. Compound complex sentences. Okay, and yeah, it's a big, complicated sounding name. Pretty simple definition. Okay, it's basically when we mix a compound sentence and a complex sentence. So here's the minimum. A compound complex sentence is when you have at least two independent clauses plus at least one dependent clause. That's it. Okay, so an example of what that would look like. Sally cried and Joe coughed because they had the flu. Sorry, that was supposed to be Sally sneezed, but apparently Sally cries when she has the flu. I got my examples mixed up, but it still is an example of a compound complex sentence. Okay, now, where you really see that, okay, the independent clauses are in green, the dependent clause is in blue. Sally cried, independent clause. Joe coughed, independent clause. Because they had the flu, dependent clause. You can write it backwards. Because they had the flu, comma, Sally cried and Joe coughed. Still a compound complex sentence. Okay, last slide. So here's one more example of a compound complex sentence. I'm giving you a simple one right here. Okay, with Sally cried, Joe coughed because they had the flu, right? Here's what a little longer version looks like. Okay, so this is a longer example. It's not a run-on, right? This is something where if in the past I've written sentences like this, and students will be like, "That's a run-on. It's too long." No, remember, length has nothing to do with what a run-on sentence is. Okay, so since the weather was cloudy, most people stayed inside. But the scientists who study weather for a living went out into the storm and took notes. However, the fierce wind blew their papers away when they opened their notebooks. Okay, here's a breakdown of how this is actually working when you look at independent clauses and dependent. Okay, everything in green will be independent, everything in blue will be dependent. Since the weather was cloudy, comma, dependent clause. Most people stayed inside, independent clause. The scientists, now here's where we have a relative clause interrupting. Okay, the independent clause is this: the scientists went out into the storm and took notes. The dependent clause is that relative part there that's interrupting it, who study weather for a living. However, the fierce wind blew their papers away, independent clause, when they opened their notebooks, dependent clause. Okay? That whole thing is a compound, complex sentence. Okay? They can be, so at the minimum, it's 2 independent clauses plus 1 dependent clause. There is no maximum. Okay? Theoretically, it could go on indefinitely as long as it's punctuated the right way. Okay? Now, wouldn't recommend doing that. Okay? But there is no maximum. It could go on for a long, long time if you so chose. Okay? So that's what it is. Okay? Any questions? What makes it work? It's punctuated the right way. It's using conjunctions correctly. Okay? That's why it works. That's why it's not a run-on. Right? Everything's punctuated right, proper conjunctions, makes it make sense. Okay? We'll do some makeup quizzes tomorrow. That's it for today.